The river was roaring. Ellen Bell stood on the far bank, mud soaking through the hem of her dress, her boots sinking into the soft earth at the edge of the Rio Salado, and she turned to look back across the churning brown water at the man still standing on the other side. He was speaking. She could see his mouth moving, his broad shoulders squared, his hat pushed back in that particular way he had when he was certain he was right about something. The current between them was loud enough to swallow most of his words, but she caught the shape of them well enough. He was telling her the river would rise before she could cross. He was telling her to wait. She had already crossed. The water still dripped from her skirts. Her heart was slamming against her ribs with a force that had nothing to do with the cold of the water and everything to do with the man watching her from the other shore. Clarence Whitfield. She had known him for 6 months. She had trusted him for 5. And she had loved him without quite meaning to, for at least 4 of those months, though she had spent most of that time telling herself it was something else. Admiration, perhaps, or gratitude, or the simple loneliness of a woman who had come west with nothing and found herself dependent on the goodwill of a man who had every reason not to give it. He had told her the river would rise. He had been so sure, the way he was always sure, with that low, unhurried voice and those dark, steady eyes that made you feel the world would obey him simply because he expected it to. And she had listened to him, the way she always listened to him, right up until the moment she decided she couldn't afford to listen anymore. Because waiting meant losing the ranch, and losing the ranch meant losing the only thing she had left of her father. She stood on the far bank and watched Clarence Whitfield's expression change as the full meaning of what she had done settled over him. First surprise, sharp and bright, cutting across those composed features like lightning across a flat sky. Then something softer, something she didn't have a word for yet, something that looked almost like wonder. And then, because the river was still rising and the water was pulling at the broken trunk she had crossed on, he began to move. He waded into his knees without hesitation, reached back for the rope he'd tied to his saddle, and started toward her. And that was the moment Ellen Bell understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, that this man had not been trying to stop her. He had been afraid for her. Those were not the same thing at all. But to understand how they had arrived at this particular riverbank, on this particular afternoon in the autumn of 1874, with everything between them balanced on the knife edge of a single crossing, you would have to go back. You would have to go back to the day Ellen Bell arrived in the town of Seco Falls, New Mexico Territory, with $22 in her bag, a land deed in her coat pocket, and a name she was carrying like a stone she couldn't put down. The stagecoach had rolled into Seco Falls on a Tuesday in late March, trailing a cloud of red dust that settled over everything like a judgment. Ellen was 26 years old and she had been traveling for 11 days, from St. Louis through Kansas and into the territory, and she was so tired that when the driver called the stop she sat motionless for a long moment before her body remembered how to move. The woman beside her, a broad-shouldered Tejana named Mrs. Rios, who was returning home from visiting her sister, pressed a tin of peppermints into Ellen's hand before she stepped out. "You look like you need sweetness more than I do," she said, and was gone before Ellen could thank her properly. Seco Falls was not what Ellen had imagined, though she was honest enough with herself to admit she hadn't known what to imagine. The town was a single long street with a mercantile, a livery stable, a land office, 2 saloons, a small adobe church that was newer than it looked, and a scattering of houses that spread out behind the main street like a hand of cards dropped carelessly. Beyond the town, the land opened up into a vast expanse of high desert and scrub grass that went on until it met the mountains. And the mountains were enormous and blue, and so far away they looked like they had been painted onto the sky by someone who had never quite believed in distances. Ellen stood on the plank sidewalk outside the stage station with her trunk beside her and her carpet bag in her hand, and tried to feel something other than exhausted. She had inherited her father's ranch 2 months ago, after the letter came to St. Louis, informing her that Thomas Bell had died of a fever and left everything he owned to his only daughter. She had not seen her father in 4 years. They had parted badly, over a disagreement that seemed important at the time and hollow now, the way all such disagreements become hollow when there is no longer a chance to repair them. The ranch was called the Bell Quarter, and it sat 12 miles southeast of Seco Falls on the banks of the Rio Salado, and it was, according to the letter from the lawyer in town, a working cattle operation with a small herd and 2 hired hands, and a house that needed a new roof but was otherwise sound. What the lawyer's letter had not mentioned was that there was a competing claim on the land. She found that out in the first 10 minutes, standing in the cramped office of one Mr. Harlan Prout, who was the town's land agent, and who had the particular quality of a man who had grown too comfortable in a chair that was slightly too large for his authority. "There's a matter of some complexity," Prout said, arranging papers on his desk with a fussiness that felt rehearsed. "Your father's original deed was properly filed, Miss Bell. No question there. But a gentleman by the name of Aldous Crane has filed an adjacent claim that overlaps your eastern boundary by approximately 40 acres, including the section that contains your primary water access. If you can't produce documentation supporting your father's original survey, there is a legal process that will need to—" "How long does that process take?" Ellen asked. Prout folded his hands. "Months, possibly the better part of a year." Ellen looked out the window at the dusty street. "And who is Aldous Crane?" Prout's expression shifted in a way that told her more than his words would. "He is a man of considerable resources in this territory." She found her father's hired hands the next morning, 2 brothers named Pete and Domingo Vasquez, who had been running the cattle and keeping the Bell Quarter going on credit and faith while they waited to see what the heir would do. They were good men, earnest and direct, and they told her things about Aldous Crane that Prout had carefully avoided. Crane was a land speculator who had been quietly acquiring properties along the Rio Salado for 3 years. He wanted the water rights. The cattle were secondary. The houses and the families on those properties were entirely irrelevant to him. He had already pushed 2 homesteaders off their land through legal pressure, and one, a widow named McCready, through a combination of legal pressure and what Pete Vasquez described with uncomfortable precision as bad luck that seemed arranged. Ellen listened to all of this and then asked where she could find a lawyer who was not afraid of Aldous Crane. Both brothers looked at each other. Then Pete said, "There's Clarence Whitfield." She had pictured a lawyer's office when they pointed her down the street. What she found instead was the back room of the livery stable, where a man in a work shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbows was shoeing a bay mare with the methodical attention of someone who had done it 10,000 times. The room smelled of horse and hay and iron. There was a desk in the corner with stacks of papers that looked, despite everything, organized. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. He looked up. She had not expected him to be young. He was perhaps 30, 31, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead, and a face that was weathered but not hard, the kind of face that had spent a long time in difficult weather and come through it without becoming bitter. He had serious eyes, dark brown, that settled on her with an attentiveness that was not unfriendly but was entirely unsentimental. He was, she would later understand, a man who had learned to see clearly because he had paid a steep price once for seeing what he wanted to see instead. "You're Thomas Bell's daughter," he said. It was not a question. "Ellen Bell," she said. "I've been told you're a lawyer." Among other things, he set down the hoof pick and straightened. "I heard you were coming. I wondered if you'd make it all the way from St. Louis." He said it without condescension, more like a statement of genuine uncertainty. Most people, when they find out about Crane, come to the edge and look at what they'd be walking into and find something else to do. "I'm not most people," Ellen said. He looked at her for a moment in that direct, assessing way. Then he said, "No, I don't think you are." He crossed to the desk and pulled out a chair for her. "Sit down, Miss Bell. Tell me what you know and I'll tell you what I know and we'll see what can be done." That was the beginning of it. What Clarence Whitfield knew was considerable. He had grown up in the territory, the son of a rancher who had built his operation legitimately and lost most of it to a man not unlike Crane through a combination of debt, drought, and legal manipulation when Clarence was 17. His father had not recovered from the loss. Not financially, not spiritually. He had died when Clarence was 20, and Clarence had spent the following years doing the two things he thought might matter: learning the law well enough to use it, and staying in the territory where men like Crane operated with impunity, because someone had to know how they worked. He was not, he told her carefully in that first conversation, a man who made promises he couldn't keep. He could help her build a case. He could help her navigate the legal process. What he could not promise was that the legal process would move faster than Crane's money. "What are the chances?" Ellen asked. Honest answer: always. Right now, Crane has the advantage. He has the territorial court friendly to him, and he has time on his side. You need documentation of your father's original survey, and you need it before the court date, which Prout will try to schedule as quickly as possible because a quick schedule favors Crane. He paused. But your father was not a careless man. I knew him slightly. If that survey documentation exists, he kept it somewhere. Where? That is the question we need to answer. So began the strangest and most consequential 6 months of Ellen Bell's life. She moved onto the Bell Quarter with Pete and Domingo Vasquez and began to run it, because the alternative was to let it sit idle and give Crane's lawyers grounds to argue abandonment. She learned what she didn't know about cattle, which was most things. Pete was patient with her questions. Domingo was patient with her mistakes. She got better. The land was hard and beautiful, and it asked things of you that nothing instant. Louis had prepared her for, and she found, to her own surprise, that she was equal to most of what it asked. Not all of it, but most. Clarence came out to the ranch twice a week, ostensibly to work on the legal case, though the work of the case expanded naturally to encompass other things: examining the land itself, understanding the water flow, walking the disputed eastern boundary with a surveying compass that he used with the casual expertise of a man who had learned it out of necessity. He was methodical and thorough, and he explained things to her as he went without being condescending about it, which she appreciated more than she knew how to say. She noticed things about him carefully and against her will. The way he listened, fully and without interruption, as if what she was saying was genuinely the most important information currently available. The way he was with the Vasquez brothers, respectful and direct, none of the reflexive dismissal that most Anglo men of her acquaintance directed at Mexican workers without even noticing they were doing it. The way he looked at the land, not as something to be used or conquered, but as something with its own logic that it was worth your time to understand. She also noticed that he never spoke about himself unless she asked, and even then the answers were brief and careful, as if he had learned to treat personal history as something that required rationing. She asked once gently about his father, and he answered honestly but without self-pity, and she thought about that answer for a long time afterward. "Crane did the same to your family that he's doing to mine," she said. Not Crane specifically, someone of the same type. He was looking out at the Rio Salado, which was running low in the July heat, a thin glittering thread between its banks. This territory has attracted a particular kind of man who understood early that the law was still unformed enough to be shaped by whoever got there first. Some of them built things honestly. Some of them built things by breaking other things. And you've been here fighting them ever since. I've been here trying to even the odds, he said. That's the most I can claim. She wanted to ask him something else. She stopped herself. The line between them was still professional. He was her legal representative. She was his client. And there were good practical reasons to keep it that way, not least because she could not afford to let anything cloud her judgment while Crane was circling. She had learned that lesson about judgment the hard way, 2 years ago in St. Louis, with a man named Howard Chambers who had been charming and plausible, and whose dark past she had not looked for carefully enough. She had come close to marrying him before a friend showed her a letter that revealed him as a man with a wife already in Cincinnati, and debts that would have become her debts the moment she said yes. She had been careful with her trust ever since. Clarence seemed to understand this, or at least to respect it, without her having to explain it. He kept the proper distance. He was professional and warm and occasionally funny, in a dry, understated way that made her laugh when she wasn't expecting to. He brought her coffee in the mornings when he came out early, and listened to her talk about the ranch problems that had nothing to do with the legal case with the same focused attention he gave to the legal problems. He fixed a section of fence one afternoon simply because he noticed it needed doing and he had the tools. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself it was kindness, not particular kindness, just the general variety. She told herself she was in the middle of a legal fight that could cost her everything, and this was the worst possible time to let a hidden motive, even one as simple as wanting, cloud her thinking. She believed herself mostly until August. It was an evening in early August, after a day spent riding the eastern boundary with Pete to document landmarks for the case, and she was sitting on the porch of the Bell Quarter house watching the sun go down behind the western range, when Clarence rode up later than usual, later than she'd expected him. He came onto the porch and sat in the other chair, and for a while they just watched the sunset, which was doing the extraordinary thing that sunsets did in New Mexico territory, painting the sky in colors that seemed excessive and true at the same time. "I got a letter today," he said after a while. She waited. "From a judge I know in Santa Fe, a man I trust." He paused. "Crane has a contact in the territorial court who's been marking cases, arranging outcomes. There's a process underway to expose it, but it takes time. It means if we can get your case moved to a different venue, to a judge who isn't in Crane's pocket, the landscape changes considerably." "How do we do that?" "We file a motion challenging jurisdiction. I've drafted it." He was quiet for a moment. "But the survey documentation matters more than ever. Without it, even a fair judge has nothing to work with. We need your father's original field work, his personal records." Ellen had been thinking about this since their first conversation. Her father had kept records, she knew this from childhood. She knew that about him even after all the years and the estrangement. He had been a precise and private man who documented everything and trusted institutions very little, and so kept his own copies of everything that mattered. But the house had been searched after his death. She knew that too, by persons unknown, and if something had not been found, it meant it was either hidden deliberately or was somewhere she hadn't looked. "There's a strong box," she said slowly. She had been circling this memory for weeks, not quite certain if it was real or something she had constructed from need. "My father had a strong box. When I was young, before I went to St. Louis, I remember him saying once that the ranch itself was his insurance policy. Not the cattle, the land, and that the proof of it was as solid as the land it described. I thought he was just talking, but now I wonder if he meant it literally." Clarence looked at her. Where would he have put something he wanted to keep as safe as the land itself? They looked at each other, and the same thought arrived in both their minds at the same moment. She could see it happen on his face, the slight lift at the corners of his mouth, the flash of something that was equal parts intelligence and hope. "The foundation," she said. They looked the next morning. Under the hearthstone of the main fireplace, in a cavity that had been sealed with mortar and was invisible unless you knew it was there, and looked with a lamp held close to the floor, they found it. A small iron strongbox with a lock that Pete Vasquez opened with a cold chisel in about 40 seconds flat, revealing inside a stack of papers wrapped in oilskin that had kept them perfectly dry and intact. Original survey notes, field measurements, a signed affidavit from the surveyor, one James Craddock of Santa Fe, dated 1861, detailing the exact boundaries of the Bell Quarter parcel, including the full extent of the Rio Salado water access. Everything they needed. Ellen sat on the floor of the house her father had built and held the papers her father had hidden, and cried in a way she hadn't cried since the letter arrived informing her of his death. Not elegant tears. Messy, undignified, full-body grief that also contained relief and love and rage and something she couldn't name. Clarence sat beside her on the floor without touching her, without saying anything, just present in a way that asked nothing from her and offered everything in the way of simple company. After a while she stopped and pressed the oilskin-wrapped papers to her chest and breathed and looked at him. He knew, she said. He knew someone would come for the land eventually. He prepared for it. He trusted you to come, Clarence said quietly. That broke something open in her that she hadn't known was closed. She looked at this man who had been a stranger 5 months ago and who had become the most reliable person in her life. This man with his careful distances and his dry humor and his dark past mapped onto his face in lines that made him look not hard but tested. And she thought, with a clarity that felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure, I am in serious trouble. She did not say this. She folded the papers back into the oilskin and stood up and said they needed to get to Santa Fe as soon as possible, and Clarence agreed, and they spent the rest of the day being professional and purposeful, and she was very careful not to look at him for too long at a time. Santa Fe was 3 days' ride. They went with Pete Vasquez as a third party, which was both practical for safety and useful for the maintaining of appropriate distances. The ride itself was extraordinary. The land they crossed was magnificent in the way that indifferent things sometimes are, meaning it was beautiful and harsh with equal unconcern for what you thought about it, and Ellen found that she didn't mind this. She had grown up in the measured greenness of Missouri, and she had loved it. But there was something about this territory, this particular quality of light and space, that had gotten under her skin in a way she hadn't anticipated. They reached Santa Fe on the third evening and went directly to the office of Clarence's contact in the court system, a measured older man named Judge Alfredo Montoya, who had been on the territorial bench for 20 years and had, Clarence told her quietly before they went in, refused to be bought twice. The first time Crane's money had been offered to him, Montoya had thrown the man carrying it out of his chambers personally. Crane had understood the message and had simply routed his money elsewhere. Montoya examined the documents for 2 hours. When he was done, he looked at Ellen across his desk with the same kind of steady, unhurried assessment that Clarence had given her on that first morning in the livery stable, and she thought briefly that perhaps this quality of attention was something the territory produced, or perhaps it was simply something produced by the practice of seeing things clearly under difficult conditions. This documentation is complete, Montoya said. The survey is properly executed and legally sound. With this, the competing claim has no basis in law. He paused. There will still be a hearing. Crane will not walk away without a fight. Let him fight, Ellen said. He'll be fighting in the open with proper documentation on the other side. Montoya looked at Clarence. You've prepared a motion on venue. Ready to file tomorrow morning, Clarence said. Montoya nodded slowly. Then I will make certain I am assigned to this case. He said it simply, as a statement of fact, without drama, and somehow the absence of drama made it more powerful, not less. They stayed 2 nights in Santa Fe. On the second evening, after the motion had been filed and the case had formally shifted to Montoya's courtroom, after the immediate crisis had been addressed, and the next phase of the fight was clearly mapped, Clarence and Ellen walked through the plaza in the long golden light of late September and said nothing for a very long time, and the silence was not awkward. It was the silence of 2 people who had been running very fast towards something and had now paused and found themselves standing in the same place. You didn't have to stay, she said eventually. When I arrived in Seco Falls, you could have told me the odds and sent me back. He was quiet for a step or two. That's not something I would do. I know that now, she said. I didn't know it then, but I know it now. He stopped walking. She stopped too. The plaza was busy with the ordinary life of the city evening, people crossing in all directions, the smell of wood smoke and food from nearby houses, the mountains going dark in the distance. He was looking at her with that expression she had been trying not to identify for months, and she had run out of alternative explanations for it. "Ellen," he said. Just her first name, which he hadn't used before. It changed the air between them in a way that was almost physical. She should have been careful. She had all her reasons for caution, all her history with Howard Chambers and what came of trusting too quickly, all her practical understanding that the case wasn't over and she needed to keep her wits clear. She had all of that. "Clarence," she said, just his first name back. And that was, as it turned out, quite enough. He didn't reach for her. He asked with his eyes, in the particular way that meant she could have said no, and had it be perfectly respected. And she said yes with hers, and he took her hand very carefully, as if it were something he might break. And they stood in the middle of the Santa Fe Plaza in the September evening holding hands like two people who had been navigating toward this point for months, and were finally willing to admit they'd arrived. It was not, she thought, like the consuming recklessness of her St. Louis years, that headlong quality that had made Howard Chambers possible. It was something quieter and more structural, like the way a building is different from a tent, not less warm but more certain, built to last through kinds of weather that a tent cannot survive. On the ride back to Seco Falls the following morning, Pete Vasquez rode ahead and did not look back and showed no expression whatsoever, though Ellen would have sworn she could see a smile in the set of his shoulders. The weeks that followed were busy with the legal preparations for the hearing, which Montoya had scheduled for November. Ellen worked the Bell Quarter and studied the case documents, and rode the disputed boundary so many times she could have drawn it from memory in the dark. Clarence came every day now, some mornings, most evenings, and the professional distances were maintained in public, and in the presence of the Vasquez brothers, not out of dishonesty, but out of a shared understanding that in the territory of 1874, a woman fighting a land claim needed her reputation for seriousness intact. What existed between them was real and serious enough to be worth protecting. He was different when they were alone, not a different person but a fuller one, as if he kept some portion of himself held back against ordinary exposure and only released it in particular company. He told her about his father without the careful rationing he applied to that subject in other contexts. He told her about the years after his father's death when he had worked as a ranch hand, and then as a surveyor's assistant, and had read law books at night by whatever light was available. He told her about the woman he had almost married at 24, a schoolteacher from Albuquerque named Clara Reeves, who had chosen, wisely and with no cruelty intended, to go back east rather than stay in the territory and wait for a man who was fighting battles that might not end in his lifetime. "Did you blame her?" Ellen asked. "No," he said. "She was right. I was asking too much without offering enough. And now," he looked at her steadily, "now I think I might finally have something worth offering." She reached across the small table between their chairs and took his hand, which was calloused and warm and familiar in a way that felt already ancient, as if she had been holding this hand for years, as if her own hand had always known the shape of it. Then October came, and with it the trouble. Crane did not wait for the hearing. Ellen understood later that he had seen Montoya's assignment to the case and understood what it meant, that the legal avenue was closing, that if the hearing proceeded with that documentation and that judge, he would lose. And men like Crane did not respond to the closing of one avenue by accepting defeat. They looked for other avenues. They applied pressure in other directions. They reminded you that the law was one arena and life was a larger one. It began with small things. A fence cut on the eastern boundary. The Vasquez brothers' horses turned out in the night. Then larger. Pete Vasquez rode into Seco Falls for supplies and was confronted by 3 men who worked for Crane and was told, with specific reference to his family in Mora, that his employment at the Bell Quarter was becoming a health liability. Pete came back and told Ellen and Domingo everything. Ellen sat with it for one day, then rode to Clarence. He listened. His expression did not change much during the telling, but she had learned to read him well enough to see the controlled anger working beneath the surface, a deep and careful anger that was worse for being controlled, like a river beneath ice. "He's trying to isolate you," Clarence said. "Make the ranch impossible to run by removing the people who support you." "I won't let Pete and Domingo be put in danger on my account," Ellen said. "Neither will I." He was quiet for a moment. "There are things we can do. I have friends in the territory, men who owe me favors, men who have their own reasons to want Crane's methods exposed. I'll call some of those in. And there's the matter of the threats to Pete. That is a criminal matter, not a civil one, and I have a letter I can write to the federal marshal in Albuquerque that will be worth writing. How long will that take? Weeks, maybe more." He looked at her. "Can you hold the ranch for that long?" "I can hold it," she said, with more certainty than she felt, though the certainty wasn't entirely false. What she hadn't accounted for was Crane's decision to escalate more dramatically and more quickly than either of them had predicted. 3 days after her conversation with Clarence, she woke at dawn to find the water table at the Rio Salado, which fed the Bell Quarter's primary trough system, dramatically altered. Someone upstream had interfered with the natural flow, not destroyed it, but diverted enough of it to drop the water level significantly and damage the cattle's access. It was clever and vicious, and almost certainly legal in the specific technical sense that Crane's people would have been careful about while absolutely violating the spirit of everything. She rode out to assess it herself, with Domingo, on a gray morning in mid-October, and found not only the water diversion but evidence of something more alarming: tracks suggesting a party of men had been on the Bell Quarter land overnight, circling the buildings, as if measuring something. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had discovered this about herself in the months since coming west. But she was frightened now, and she was frightened specifically because the danger wasn't to her alone. It was to the Vasquez brothers, who had given 6 months of their lives to this fight. It was to the principle that the law meant something, that documents kept in strongboxes were worth keeping, that a man like Thomas Bell, who had built something honest, had built something that should be allowed to stand. She sent word to Clarence that evening. He arrived before dawn the next morning, riding hard, and she met him at the door of the house, and he looked at her face and said, "Tell me everything," and she did, and he listened with that complete attention, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment. "The hearing is 6 weeks away," he said. "I know. We need to get the survey documentation to Santa Fe and filed in a form that Crane can't touch. What we have now is here at the ranch, and here isn't safe enough." "Then we go to Santa Fe again," she said. "We go to Santa Fe again," he agreed. "But first we need to get through the Rio Salado crossing, and there's a problem." She looked at him. "I rode past the crossing at the lower ford this morning. The diversion Crane's men made upstream has already dropped the far channel, but with the rains that came through the upper range yesterday," he stopped. He looked at her with that clear, honest directness. "The river will rise, not tonight but tomorrow. The runoff from the storm will hit the Salado by mid-morning, and it will be impassable by afternoon. If we're going to cross safely, we go before dawn tomorrow." Ellen looked out the window at the dark October sky. The stars were very clear. "All right," she said, "before dawn." But it was Domingo, late that evening, who brought word that Crane's men were watching the lower ford. 3 of them camped on the near bank with horses ready, which meant that a crossing at first light would be visible and potentially intercepted, which meant the lower ford was compromised, which meant the upper crossing. The upper crossing was not a ford. It was a place where, in normal water conditions, a large cottonwood that had fallen across a narrow section of the river created a rough bridge passable on foot, not on horseback, but passable. Clarence knew it. He had used it once years ago in a different emergency. "It's riskier," he said. They were sitting at the kitchen table of the Bell Quarter house, the lamp between them, maps spread out, the night quiet outside. "The river is already running higher than usual from the diversion. By morning it will be even higher. That cottonwood has been in place for years, but it won't be there forever. But Crane's men don't know about it, Ellen said. Probably not. Your father found it accidentally. I doubt it appears on any survey. She was watching him. He was watching the map, but the map was not what he was thinking about. You're going to tell me to wait, she said. He looked up. I'm going to tell you that the river will rise before you can cross safely. That if we wait for the lower ford to be clear, if we get word to the marshal, he stopped. He looked at her with something that was not just professional assessment anymore, something unguarded and urgent, which was not an expression she was accustomed to seeing on his face. I'm going to tell you that I don't want you on that river in those conditions. Because the case. Because of you, he said, not the case. The plainness of it stopped her. He had never said anything that plain about what mattered to him. She sat with it for a moment, with the weight of the words, which were not large words but were carrying something enormous. Clarence, she said carefully, how long will we wait if we wait for the lower ford? Days, maybe longer. And in those days Crane will know we haven't moved. He'll move. Probably. And the hearing is 6 weeks away and we need the documentation in Santa Fe. Yes. Then I'm going at first light, she said, before the river rises. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. He understood. She could see that he understood. He understood both the logic and the thing beneath it, the thing that said she had crossed too many distances to be stopped by a river, that she had come from St. Louis with $22 in her father's name, and she was not going to let Aldous Crane or a swollen river or anything else take the rest of it. I'll go with you, he said. You can't ride across on the cottonwood. I'll manage. They went before dawn. Domingo rode with them to the edge of the upper crossing and stayed with the horses. Clarence tied a long rope to his saddle horn and coiled the other end and went first across the cottonwood, testing each step, and made it to the far bank and turned back to watch her. Ellen stood at the near edge of the cottonwood bridge in the gray pre-dawn light, with the river running cold and loud beneath it, running higher than she'd seen it before, the brown water pulling at the log, and she looked across at Clarence standing on the far bank, and she saw him open his mouth. He was telling her the river would rise before she could cross. She stepped onto the cottonwood. She crossed in the time it took him to finish speaking. It was not reckless. She was careful, she was precise. She tested each grip and each footfall the way she had learned to test everything in this territory, with attention and respect, not with fear. The water splashed her skirts and pulled at her balance, and she let the rope he'd thrown her guide the last section, and then her boot hit the far bank and she was standing beside him, wet and cold and entirely, completely solid. He was staring at her, that expression surprise, then wonder, then something that was not wonder but was softer and larger than it. You were already on the other side, he said. I was already on the other side, she said. He grabbed her then, not roughly but completely, both arms around her in the way that said he had been holding that back for a very long time and was done holding it back, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart hammering against her cheek, and understood that all that calm composure had been covering something as undignified and urgent as what she herself had been covering. Don't do that to me again, he said into her hair. I make no promises, she said, muffled against him. He pulled back enough to look at her face, and then, because the river was still roaring and Crane's men were somewhere behind them, and the documentation was in the oilskin wrapped around her middle, and Santa Fe was still 2 days away, he kissed her in the practical, certain way of a man who has been waiting long enough and has decided to stop waiting. And she kissed him back in the equally practical way of a woman who has known for some time what she wanted and has decided the moment is here, whether the circumstances are convenient or not. Then they crossed the rest of the territory to Santa Fe. The ride took 2.5 days. They kept off the main roads, using Clarence's knowledge of the terrain, and they talked as they rode in a way that was different from all the months of careful professional conversation. Openly, without the rationing, the full story in both directions. She told him about Howard Chambers and what she had learned from that near catastrophe about the difference between charm and character. He told her about the year after Clara Reeves left, How he had stayed in the territory not out of heroism, but because he hadn't known where else to go. How purpose had come slowly, assembled out of cases and days, and the particular satisfaction of helping people whose problems were genuine. "Did you ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Many times," he said. "I stayed because leaving felt like abandonment, like I would be doing to this place what was being done to the people in it." He paused. "And then you arrived and I started having better reasons to stay." She felt the warmth of that settle in her chest like something solid. "You knew from the beginning." "I knew from approximately the third day," he said. "When you rode the eastern boundary in a skirt that was not designed for riding and did not complain once and asked better questions than any lawyer I've worked with, I decided it would be deeply inappropriate to mention it." "It would have been," she agreed. "It also would have been true." They reached Santa Fe on the second evening, went directly to Montoya's office, and filed the documentation in a form that was now protected by the court's own records, certified copies made and witnessed, originals secured, the full chain of legal protection in place. When they came out of the courthouse onto the street, the sun was going down in that extravagant New Mexico way, and Ellen stood on the steps and felt something release in her that had been clenched for months. Montoya had said something else to them as they left, in the quiet, direct way of a man who chose his words with care. "The hearing in 3 weeks will be a formality." With this documentation and Crane's record of intimidation on the other side, the outcome is not in doubt. He had paused. "You built something worth building here, Miss Bell, in more than one sense." He had looked at Clarence when he said it, briefly and without elaboration, and Clarence had not quite managed to keep his expression entirely neutral, and Ellen had not managed to keep her smile entirely private, and Montoya had shown no expression at all, which was probably the most eloquent response available. They stayed 2 nights in Santa Fe before beginning the return journey, and on the second evening Clarence took her to a small restaurant near the plaza that served food from the region, red chili, and roasted lamb and bread that was so good it seemed unfair. And across the candle-lit table they talked about things that had nothing to do with Crane or the case or the legal machinery that had been consuming their lives for months. They talked about Missouri and New Mexico. About music, because it turned out he played the fiddle, badly he said, which she didn't believe, and she had learned piano as a child in the way that all girls of her class had been expected to learn piano and had found she genuinely loved it. They talked about books, of which they had each read a remarkable number given the context in which they had each been doing their reading. "What happens after the hearing?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The candlelight moved on his face. "What do you want to happen? I asked you first." A slight smile, that dry quality she had come to love. "I want the Bell quarter to be secure, and the case to be closed and Crane to have no more leverage over anyone along the Rio Salado." A pause. "And I want to have a conversation with you about the future that isn't conducted under conditions of legal emergency." "That seems reasonable," she said. "I thought you might think so," he said. "I have been known to have reasonable ideas on occasion." She looked at him across the table and thought about what 6 months did to a person's understanding of another person. Not just the accumulating facts, but the texture of it, the way you learned someone's silences as well as their words, the way you learned what their face did when they were worried versus when they were thinking versus when they were feeling something they had decided not to say. She knew all of that about him now. She knew his patience and his anger and his humor and his grief and the way he looked at the land and the way he looked at her, which were related, she thought, in the sense that both of them were things he had decided were worth caring for. "Clarence," she said, "Ellen, I am going to stay in New Mexico territory. I thought you might. I'm going to make the Bell quarter work. I have been making it work for 6 months and I'm going to keep making it work." "I know you are," he said, with perfect confidence, "and I would very much like for you to stop coming out to the ranch in a professional capacity and start coming out in a different one." The smile that came was different from the dry, brief ones she had catalogued over months. It was full and unguarded, and it changed his face in the way that made her think, not for the first time, that this was what he looked like when he was fully himself and not holding anything back, and she wanted to go on seeing it for the rest of her life. "I would like that too," he said. "Very much." The hearing was held in Montoya's courtroom in Santa Fe on the 14th of November, 1874. Crane attended with 2 lawyers and a territorial representative, and a room full of associates who were there, Ellen thought, for the purpose of making the room feel weighted in a particular direction. She attended with Clarence, Pete, and Domingo Vasquez, and the documentation her father had sealed under the hearthstone of the Bell Quarter fireplace 13 years earlier. Crane's lawyers argued for an hour. They were skilled and expensive, and they used every technical formulation available to them, and Montoya listened to all of it with the attention of a man who had been listening to arguments for 20 years and could tell the difference between substance and arrangement. When they were done, he looked at Clarence, who spoke for 20 minutes clearly and without flourish, and then Montoya took 30 minutes to review the documentation himself, which he did at the bench with the same methodical focus, and then he ruled. The Bell Quarter boundaries as established by the original survey of 1861 were legally sound and conclusive. The competing claim filed by Aldous Crane had no basis in the documented record and was dismissed. The Bell Quarter's water access rights were affirmed in full. Crane was ordered to remove any obstructions to the natural flow of the Rio Salado within 30 days or face further legal action, which action Montoya indicated he would take a personal interest in expediting. Crane stood up. His face was the color of old clay, and his expression was the expression of a man who had decided the only appropriate response to losing was to look as if he were the one who had chosen not to win. He said something to his lawyers in a low voice and walked out of the courtroom without looking at Ellen, which was, she thought, exactly right. Ellen sat very still for a moment after the ruling. The room was moving around her, the lawyers collecting papers, the Vasquez brothers shaking hands with each other, Montoya gathering his documents with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had delivered hundreds of rulings and had learned not to attach drama to any individual one. And beside her, very quietly, Clarence put his hand over hers on the table, and she turned her hand over and held on. "Your father would have been proud of you," he said. She thought about Thomas Bell, private and precise, hiding the survey documentation under the hearthstone in 1861, because he understood the kind of country he was building in and trusted that someone would come for it eventually. She thought about the letter she had received in St. Louis and how she had almost not come. How she had stood in her apartment with the letter in her hand and thought about everything she had left behind and everything she didn't know, and how she had packed anyway, because some things are worth the distance. "He was a stubborn man," she said. "I think it might be hereditary." Clarence laughed, a real full laugh, the one she had been collecting since August, and Pete Vasquez, who had overheard from across the table, said something to Domingo in Spanish that made Domingo laugh too, and the courtroom filled up briefly with the sound of it, which was, Ellen thought, a good sound for a room like this to hold for a while. They rode back to Seco Falls in a party of 4 and arrived on a clear evening in mid-November, and Seco Falls greeted them with the ordinary indifference of a small town that has its own concerns, which was exactly the right kind of greeting. The mercantile was open. The livery was occupied. Mrs. Rios, the woman from the stagecoach who had pressed peppermints into Ellen's hand 8 months ago, was crossing the street in the other direction and stopped when she saw Ellen and said, "I heard you won your case," with the satisfied air of someone who had expected this outcome all along. "We did," Ellen said. Mrs. Rios looked at Clarence and then at Ellen and made no comment whatsoever, but the look she gave Ellen before she walked on conveyed volumes. The months that followed were the best months of Ellen Bell's life to date, which was a thing she held with some wonder because she had not, When she arrived in Seco Falls in March with $22 in her father's name and 11 days of stagecoach dust on her clothes, imagine that this was what was waiting for her. Not the winning of the case, which she had allowed herself to hope for. Not the running of the ranch, which she had found to be harder and more satisfying than anything she had done before. But this, the ordinary, extraordinary texture of days lived alongside someone who had become the central fact of her daily life. Clarence had an office now, a proper one. He had taken a room above the Seco Falls Mercantile and installed a desk and bookshelves, and the accumulated document files of years of legal work in the territory. He had more clients than before. Word had traveled, the way word does in small territories, about the Bell Quarter case, and about what it meant that Crane had lost, and people who had been afraid to pursue legitimate claims against men of Crane's type were beginning to come forward. He was busy in a way that had purpose running through it. She could see it in him, the difference between a man who is occupied and a man who is doing the thing he was built to do. He came to the Bell Quarter most evenings and stayed for dinner, and after dinner they sat on the porch in the December cold with their coats on and talked about everything and nothing in the way of people who have an inexhaustible interest in each other's minds. Pete Vasquez, who had a gift for stating obvious truths in the most straightforward possible way, said one afternoon while he and Ellen were mending fence, "You should just marry him. The fence would still get mended. The cows would still need water. Nothing would change except you'd stop pretending you haven't already decided." Ellen said nothing for a full minute. "I'm aware," she said finally. "Right," Pete said and went back to the fence. It was 2 weeks before Christmas when Clarence arrived at the Bell Quarter earlier than usual in the late afternoon and found Ellen in the barn doing the evening feed. He stood in the doorway for a moment and then walked in and said her name, and the quality of his voice made her look up immediately. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. She set down the feed bucket. The horses moved in their stalls in the warm, hay-smelling dark. He was not nervous, not the ordinary kind of nervous. What he was, she thought, was serious in the particular way that means a person is about to say something they have thought about very carefully and mean completely. "I have practiced this several times in my mind," he said, "and I am aware that it sounds considerably more eloquent in my head than it is going to sound out loud, and I am going to say it anyway because I have learned, partly from watching you, that the alternative to saying the difficult thing is generally worse than saying it. Clarence." "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since approximately the 3rd week of April, which I can specify that precisely because I remember exactly where we were and what you said when I understood what was happening. We were on the eastern boundary and you were pointing at a rock formation and explaining to me with complete seriousness that it resembled your 3rd-grade teacher, and I thought, that is the person I want to spend my life with, and I have been trying to be sufficiently certain of everything else involved before I said so." She was going to cry, which was inconvenient and true. She crossed the distance between them, which was not large, and put both her hands on his face and said, "I love you. I have loved you since August, which you might argue is a later date, but I point out that I had considerably more reasons to be careful." "Fair," he said. "And you are not going to do that eloquent thing in your head and leave me standing here. You are going to ask me the question." He reached into his coat pocket and took out a ring, which was not large or showy but was clearly old and clearly carefully kept, and she knew before he said it that it had been his mother's. "Ellen Bell," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said immediately without hesitation, which was the most honest answer available and also, she thought, the most characteristic one, given the accumulated evidence of who she had demonstrated herself to be over the preceding 8 months. She was not a woman who waited when she knew the answer. They married in the spring, in the small adobe church in Seco Falls, on a Saturday in April 1875, exactly 1 year after she had arrived on the stagecoach with $22. The ceremony was conducted by the priest from the church, a compact, serious man named Father Aguilar, who had been in Seco Falls for 30 years, and had a particular quality of delight in ceremonies that he kept carefully subdued, but which was visible if you were watching for it. Pete and Domingo Vasquez were there. Mrs. Rios was there in a dress of extraordinary yellow that she wore with complete authority. Judge Montoya had ridden down from Santa Fe, which he described as coincidental and which was entirely deliberate. A collection of Clarence's clients and associates from across the territory appeared in a way that suggested the invitation list had been broader than officially intended. Ellen wore a dress she had made herself from fabric ordered from the mercantile, a deep blue that Pete had told her was the color of the mountains in the early morning, which she had thought was an unusual observation from a man who spent most of his time complaining about fence-line logistics. She carried wildflowers that Domingo's wife, a warm, determined woman named Rosaria who had arrived 3 weeks earlier with her and Domingo's 2 children, had gathered that morning from the hillside behind the Bell Quarter. Clarence wore his good suit, which he had had cleaned and pressed by Mrs. Rios's sister, who did laundry and alterations from her house on the south edge of town. He had gotten a haircut, which Ellen found both endearing and slightly unnecessary since she liked his hair when it was slightly too long, but she said nothing because a man was allowed his own opinions about his own hair on his wedding day. He looked at her when she came down the aisle of the small church, and his expression was the unguarded full one she had been collecting since August, multiplied by a factor that she would need new mathematical vocabulary to describe. She had thought she was prepared for how it would feel to walk toward him in front of everyone she had come to know in this strange and beautiful place, and she was not prepared at all, in the best way. Father Aguilar said the words. Clarence said his vows in a voice that was steady and quiet and meant every syllable. Ellen said hers in a voice she had to work to keep steady but managed, because some things are worth the effort of steadiness. They exchanged the rings, his mother's plain gold band for her, a new band that Ellen had ordered from the jeweler in Santa Fe for him, and Aguilar pronounced them married, and the church made a noise that was disproportionate to its size, and Clarence kissed her in a way that was not appropriate for a church and was entirely right for a marriage. Afterward, in the open air of the Seco Falls Main Street, where tables had been set up and food had appeared from multiple households simultaneously, Judge Montoya found Ellen beside the food table and stood with her for a moment. "Your father filed his first land deed in the territorial office in 1861, Montoya said. I looked it up after the hearing. He filed it correctly and thoroughly, with a surveyor's affidavit and a full description, and a note to the filing clerk that if anyone disputed the claim, they should look very carefully at the original survey before making any assumptions." Ellen looked at him. "He was a man who understood systems," Montoya said, "and who trusted the right people to use them." He raised his glass slightly. "He would have approved of today." She thought about her father, who had died before she could repair what had broken between them, who had left her this land and this fight and this life, and who had, she understood now, trusted her to come for it even when she hadn't known yet that she was the kind of person who would. She raised her own glass. "I think he might have," she said. Life on the Bell Quarter in the years following was full in the way that lives built on honest work and genuine love are full, not without difficulty, not without loss, but thick with meaning in a way that made both the difficulty and the loss bearable. The cattle operation grew steadily through careful management, and the kind of incremental knowledge that only comes from years of specific attention to specific land. The Vasquez family became integral to the Bell Quarter's success, with Domingo eventually taking on the role of manager and Rosaria establishing a kitchen garden of legendary productivity that supplied not only the Bell Quarter household, but contributed to the growing small community that was forming along the Rio Salado as the territory developed. Clarence kept his legal practice, and it kept growing. He took cases that mattered and charged what people could afford, and turned down cases whose purpose was the arrangement of outcomes rather than the service of justice. He developed a reputation across the territory that eventually reached Santa Fe in an official form. In 1876, he was appointed by the territorial governor to a newly formed commission reviewing land claim disputes along the Rio Salado corridor, which was a formal acknowledgement of what he had been doing informally for years, and which gave him legal tools that made the work faster and more effective. Aldous Crane was not done immediately. Men like Crane are rarely done immediately. He redirected his efforts to other properties in the territory, and there were bad years along the river for people who didn't have what the Bell Quarter had: documentation, a good lawyer, and a judge who could not be bought. Ellen became, in the years following, an informal source of support and guidance for women in particular who found themselves in the kind of position she had been in on that March day when she stepped off the stagecoach. Alone, not without resources, and not knowing who to trust. She knew who to trust now, and she made it her business to tell people. Their first child was born in the spring of 1876, a boy they named Thomas James Whitfield Thomas for her father, James for Clarence's. He came into the world at the Bell Quarter house on a morning that was so clear and blue-skied that the light through the window seemed specifically arranged for the occasion, which Ellen was certain was coincidence, and chose to treat as intention because intention was the better story. He had Clarence's dark hair and Ellen's absolute certainty, expressed from approximately the second week of his life, about what he wanted and when he wanted it. Clarence held him in the lamplight of that first evening with an expression that was the quietest and fullest version of his face that Ellen had yet seen, which she would not have thought possible given the range she had already catalogued. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "He's real." "He is extremely real," Ellen said from the bed, which she had been in since morning and intended to stay in for a considerable additional time. I had not quite believed. Clarence stopped. Looked at the baby, looked at her. I had not quite believed any of it was real until right now. She understood what he meant. She had felt the same thing in different words. That thing where a life you had not known to want has become so completely the shape of your actual life that you can no longer remember clearly what the absence felt like, only that it was an absence, and that what replaced it is incomparably more alive. "It's real," she said. "All of it." He sat beside her on the edge of the bed with Thomas in the crook of his arm, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and outside the window the Rio Salado ran on its patient course, and the land stretched out in all directions the way land does in New Mexico territory, without apology or limit, and the evening came down quietly, and the stars came up one at a time, and then all at once, the way they always do in that high, dry country where the sky is very clear and very large and the darkness, when it comes, is full of light. 2 years later, in 1878, their second child came, a girl this time, whom they named Rose Margaret after Clarence's mother and Ellen's grandmother, and who arrived with considerably more drama than Thomas had managed, requiring the presence of both Mrs. Rios and Rosaria Vasquez, and a long, difficult night that ended in a morning even more clear and blue than Thomas's. Rose had Ellen's coloring and Clarence's serious eyes and an expression, from approximately birth, of someone who has already assessed the situation and found it satisfactory. Thomas, who was 2 and did not entirely understand the new development in his world, examined his sister with the thoroughness of someone conducting an inspection and pronounced her, after due consideration, acceptable. "He has your directness," Clarence told Ellen, which she took as the compliment it was intended to be. In the spring of 1879, Clarence received a letter from the territorial governor that informed him of his appointment as a justice of the territorial court, a position that would require some time in Santa Fe, but not a removal from the territory, and not, as he made immediately clear to Ellen, a removal from the Bell Quarter. They talked about it for an evening on the porch in the April dark with the smell of the desert coming in warm and clean, the children asleep inside, the river audible in the distance. "You've been working towards something like this since you were 17 years old," Ellen said. "I've been working toward it since I understood what it would mean to have it," he said. "There's a difference. At 17, I was angry. Now I understand what I'm trying to build." "What are you trying to build?" He was quiet for a moment. "A place where people don't have to hide their surveys under hearthstones," he said. "A place where the documentation means something because the institution is sound enough to protect it." She thought about her father's strongbox, the survey notes wrapped in oilskin, the faith of a man who had built something honest and prepared for the fight to keep it, who had trusted that the right person would come to fight that fight when the time came. She thought about the river rising and the Cottonwood Bridge, and the man who had told her to wait and hadn't hesitated to wade in after her when she didn't. "You should take the appointment," she said. "I had already decided," he said, "but I wanted to hear you say it." "You are occasionally infuriating," she said. "You have mentioned this before," he said, and she could hear the smile. They sat in the quiet dark of the New Mexico evening with the stars overhead and the children sleeping and the river running, and Ellen Bell Whitfield, who had come west on a stagecoach with $22 in her father's name and found, not just the land she came for, but the life she had not known to look for, thought about the particular quality of this feeling, this ordinary, extraordinary rightness, and found that she had no desire to name it more precisely than that. It was enough to have it. It was more than enough. The Rio Salado ran through its course as it had always run, indifferent to what happened on its banks in the specific way that rivers are indifferent to human affairs, while still being entirely bound up in them, providing water, marking boundaries, rising and falling with the seasons, running low in summer droughts and high in spring, and sometimes, in a particular October when the rains came fast to the upper range, running just high enough that a man standing on one side could tell a woman on the other that it wasn't safe to cross. And the woman, who had learned a great deal about this river and this land and this man in the months since she arrived, and who knew when she was being protected and when she was being underestimated, and who had spent 11 days on a stagecoach and 5 months fighting for her father's land and a lifetime learning to trust herself, stepped onto the Cottonwood Bridge before he finished speaking. She was already on the other side. She had always been going to get to the other side. The only question, from the moment she stepped off that stagecoach in March and walked into the livery stable and met a man with dark, serious eyes who listened to her as if she were the most important information currently available, had been whether she was going to the other side alone or with someone beside her. She was not alone. She had not been alone for a long time. And the river ran on, and the land held, and the stars came out over the Bell Quarter on clear, cold nights without number, and the life that had been built there on documentation and stubbornness, and the willingness to cross when crossing was necessary, was solid and warm and full of the ordinary, remarkable fact of two people who had found each other in the middle of a fight and decided to keep fighting together, which is, in the end, the most honest definition of love that the territory had ever produced. Thomas James Whitfield grew up to be a surveyor, which surprised no one who knew the family. Rose Margaret Whitfield grew up to be a lawyer, which surprised no one either, and which made Clarence's face go through the quiet, full expression when she told him, and made Ellen press her lips together over a smile she allowed to be visible approximately 3 seconds later. They had a third child in 1882, another boy they named Daniel, who had no interest in the law or surveying and a great deal of interest in horses, which suited the Bell Quarter perfectly well, and who grew up to be the kind of horseman who could read a horse's mood from across a corral, which was a gift that came from nowhere in the family and was accepted with gratitude. Clarence served on the territorial court for 12 years and used that position with the same principled stubbornness he had brought to every case since the case he had made most his own, the quiet, systematic dismantling of the arrangements by which men like Crane had been operating. He did not dismantle them completely. That was not a thing that could be done completely in a single lifetime, in a single territory, by a single judge and his wife and their growing family and their good neighbors along the river. But he made the arrangements harder. He made the documentation mean more. He gave people standing in courts that had previously treated them as background. It was not everything. It was not nothing. Ellen ran the Bell Quarter through all of it, and through the dry years and the good years and the years that were both at once, which most years are. She became one of the people you went to if you were new to the territory and didn't know who could be trusted, one of the people who knew where the help was and could get you to it. She became friends with Rosaria Vasquez in a way that was a friendship between equals, built on years of shared work and shared table, and the particular intimacy of women who have helped each other through difficult things and have stopped keeping track of who helped who last. Pete Vasquez and she had a long-running argument about whether the Northwest pasture should be used for summer grazing or left as a buffer that lasted 20 years and was never fully resolved and was, she suspected, the main source of entertainment for both of them. She wrote to her mother in St. Louis regularly. She had written for years, from before she came west, and the letters from St. Louis came back with the particular quality of a woman who was proud of a daughter she didn't quite understand, which Ellen had come to accept as its own kind of love. When Thomas was born, she sent a letter with a description that was deliberate in its specificity: the child's weight, his eyes, the sound of his first real cry in the Bell Quarter house, because she had learned from the estrangement with her father that the antidote to distance was precision. You closed the distance by being specific. You stayed connected by telling the truth of the ordinary things. Her mother came to visit in 1880, for 6 weeks in the early summer, and was startled by New Mexico territory in the way that people from Missouri often were, by the scale and dryness and the quality of the light. She was warm with Thomas and Rose, and careful with Clarence in the way of a mother, who is deciding what she thinks of the man who has her daughter. And by the end of the 6 weeks she had decided he was worthy, which she communicated through the simple mechanism of asking his opinion on 3 successive evenings, as if his opinion were the natural thing to consult, which it was. When she left, she embraced Ellen in the way she had not done since Ellen was small, without the overlay of the adult complications between them, just her mother's arms, and said, "You did right to come," and got on the stagecoach. Ellen stood on the plank sidewalk of Seco Falls and watched the stage roll out in its cloud of red dust, and thought about how she had stood in this same spot 8 months after her father's death, with $22 in her bag and her father's name in her pocket, and nothing clear ahead of her, and how everything that was now her life had grown from that standing, and that uncertainty, and that willingness to walk into the livery stable and ask for help from a stranger who had turned out to be, in the deepest sense, no stranger at all. Clarence came to stand beside her. The stagecoach was gone from sight. The dust was settling. "She likes you," Ellen said. "I know," he said with the brief, dry smile. "She expressed it by asking your opinion on things. I noticed. It's how she shows approval." "Noted," he said. "She also told me on the second evening when you were putting the children to bed that I should make sure you rest more," which she said with the authority of someone who has never successfully told you to rest. Ellen laughed. "She knows it's futile. She says it anyway. It's love." "It is," he agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him in the middle of the Seco Falls street in the morning sun, and the town moved around them in its ordinary way, and the mountains were very blue in the distance, and somewhere 12 miles southeast the Rio Salado was running its patient course through the land that bore her name and had given her everything, and this was her life, built out of stubbornness and trust, and a crossing made before the warning was finished. She would not have changed a single step.